Did you have personal encounters with Hamas?
They used to actually take us out of schools, mobilize us, and then send us to throw rocks at Israeli soldiers, at the borders, at checkpoints. I actually met Ahmed Yassin, the founder of Hamas. So Hamas had a habit of taking over mosques and then turning them away from houses of worship into propaganda outlets. It wasn't about learn how to be a jihadi. It was all about the early onset of the indoctrination.
You're saying that you were being groomed by Hamas?
Oh, very much so.
I mean, God forbid, you could have ended up in Hamas.
We've seen traces of Muslim Brotherhood infiltration around various communities in the UK. And I think Gaza just gives us an example of how they actually operate.
It's not as if there's a centralized Muslim Brotherhood brain and nervous system that is directing this plot. It is a decentralized, generational effort.
How's it actually like for an average Gazan living in this kind of post-war world, and what role does Hamas play?
So what I've been saying is that there are basically two parallel societies. They all know about it. Children in Gaza know about it. It's on social media in Arabic. And where is the World Health Organization? Where is UNICEF? Where is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? So that's happening right now in Gaza as we speak.
Hello, and thank you for joining us on The Brink. I'm Jake Wallace-Simons.
And I'm Andrew Fox. This week, we're joined by Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib. In over 2 years of conflict since the 7th of October massacre, Ahmed, who was born and brought up in Gaza and now lives in the United States, has emerged as one of the most prominent, moderate Palestinian voices.
Ahmed serves as a resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Middle East programs, where he writes extensively on Gaza's political and humanitarian affairs. He's an outspoken critic of Hamas and promotes a radically pragmatic approach to peace and Palestinian statehood as the only path forward between Palestinians and Israelis.
As President Trump announces his membership roster of the Board of Peace, the world is distracted by Ukraine, Greenland, Syria, and a looming trade war between the EU and America. Where does Gaza fit into the Middle East going forward? What does the future look like in the Gaza Strip?
We're going to be asking and hopefully answering all of those questions to some extent, but today's conversation will give a unique insight into all of them.
And if you're enjoying our podcast, don't forget to like, subscribe, share it, and leave a comment. We love to know what you think. If you're listening on audio, give the podcast 5 stars. And if you're still hitting that irritating paywall, now would be a great time to subscribe, as for the month of January, we're giving away the first month absolutely free. Sign up now at thebrinkpodcast.substack.com/New Year trial.
Now, without further ado, we present Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib on The Brink. Well, Ahmed, we haven't met in person. We've met before, but only virtually and chatted on the phone, but in person for the first time.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Delighted to be here.
Three-dimensional experience.
Indeed. Thank you. Yes, to two of my favorite intellectual challengers. I love it. I love it. So thank you for having me.
Well, it's great for you to come on The Brink, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Delighted to be here.
I mean, before we get into the nitty-gritty of Gaza and everything else, I just wanted to chat to you a bit about your background and your perspective, because it's quite an unusual perspective, sadly, that you have. What's your background and what forged you as a person?
Well, so my perspective, just to start, I want to be clear that while my lived experience is unique, my perspective is actually not that uncommon among Palestinians in Gaza. It's just that it's so unique among the diaspora communities.
And on social media.
Precisely. And we'll get to that in a second. So I have an unusual lived experience in the sense that I've lived in 3 different places. So I was born to Palestinian parents from Gaza. I was actually born and lived a short part of my life in Saudi Arabia, but that was because my dad happened to be working in Saudi at the time. It's a very common thing for a lot of Palestinians to be working in the Gulf. Nurses, doctors, engineers, etc. You make a little bit of money and then you bring that back to Gaza or the West Bank and you build a house or you buy a property. And so our family moved back and forth in the 90s, and in the mid-90s we lived in Gaza for a bit and then we went back to Saudi. We moved finally back before the second Intifada that took place in the year 2000. But I got to experience the Oslo process, or elements of the Oslo process. We had the Palestinian passport, Palestinian Authority passport. I actually flew into Gaza, the short-lived Gaza International Airport, in 1999 and in 2000. I flew into the Palestinian Airlines. Can you imagine just thinking Palestinian Airlines in Gaza?
Sad.
And I remember our first cell phone that we got, our landline, and these were both private enterprises, but they were part of the nascent Palestinian Authority infrastructure that created the ability to have banking and a private sector. And so there was just this optimism, this hope that like, oh, we're growing. There's a path. And then, of course, simultaneous with that, I remember vividly the gradual rise of Hamas. And it wasn't a rise just in terms of guns and violence. I remember the Islamization of the society, and that really came to a head when the second Intifada began in the year 2000. So I was a student. I went to UNRWA schools, the not so controversial UN agency that everyone's been hearing about. I am a child of UNRWA. My dad worked for UNRWA for he was a doctor. He ran one of its major clinics, and so did my brother. And so I got to also experience the violence associated with the second Intifada, both in terms of Palestinian-Israeli violence, but also intra-communal violence within the Palestinian society, particularly, again, as Hamas was rising and undermining Fatah, the PLO, the Palestinian Authority. You know, we all know the story that ultimately the second Intifada was meant to be a bargaining chip for Arafat, and then it got out of control. So I left in 2005.
Can I just interrupt you briefly just before we move on? Because it's just, I think listeners would and viewers would love to hear a little bit more about that period where you were in Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, it was quite some time ago now. We're talking about, when did you leave?
I left 2005.
2005, sorry, you did say that. So that period, I mean, of the creeping Islamization and the rise of Hamas, did you have personal encounters with Hamas, with some of the violence? Do you see it with your own eyes? And can you just give us a bit of a flavor of what that was like for you?
Very, very much so. So my family was independent politically, but that meant that we interacted or were in proximity to both Palestinian Authority and Hamas figures. And so, for example, when the second Intifada happened, one of the first things that Hamas did in Gaza is they used to actually take us out of schools, mobilize us, and then send us to us being students, to throw rocks at Israeli soldiers at the borders, at checkpoints. And I remember a lot of parents, including mine, would warn you, do not throw rocks because you get shot, you get hurt.
How old were you then?
So I was 10 at the time. This was into the year 2000. I'm 35 right now. I feel like I'm 65 in a 35-year-old body. But so one of the first demonstrations that they took us to, right at the onset of the second Intifada, it had nothing to do with the Israeli military. They mobilized thousands of young kids and people, and they went and set on fire Gaza's only functional alcohol bar. This was in the year 2000. This was in November of 2000. I meant to say October. Sorry. The second Intifada began on September 28th of 2000. So in October of 2000. And I remember distinctly, but they were like, no, well, we can't face those Zionists while there is vice and filth amongst us. And so we have to really take care of that. So I remember that.
And you went along to that?
No, I thankfully I did not. But I got out of the school.
Because your parents had told you don't do it.
Precisely. But so what they would do is they would send agents of chaos. They would actually sometimes bring buses to different schools. They would pay for buses. And the goal is to load you up and go then to border areas or to Israeli checkpoints. But they brought buses and they bussed people to this bar, this liquor bar. And I was like, oh, like no school today. Great. And I just went home. But so I remember that. And then I remember like maybe 2 months later, there was a very famous hairdresser, a female hairdresser. And for the longest, like there was like a week-long period where Hamas supposedly killed her because she was engaged in some kind of prostitution ring or something. And it was rumors. And then we heard a story about the hairdresser getting in a bus with a mic and saying, "No, I'm alive. They did not kill me, and I have nothing to do with prostitution." And then they would also go after, and this actually continued for years afterwards. They killed one of them there's a small black Palestinian community in Gaza. And there was one that was our next door neighbor. The family, the clan of Abu Ghanas is what they were called. And their matriarch engaged in a lot of witchcraft and was very famous and made a lot of money. Women from all over the Gaza Strip came to Ghanas, the major patriarch, and she would do witchcraft. Like if a woman was suspecting that her husband is gonna cheat on her or whatever, she would do this slow, spell or whatever. I mean, you can think what you want of that. Hamas killed her because they said this is heresy, this is a violation of true Islam, etc. And numerous other examples. Hamas, for example, later on would outlaw, when they took over the Gaza Strip, as soon as they took over the Gaza Strip, they would outlaw women smoking hookah on the beaches, even though beaches were full of people, but there was no smoking of the hookah, because they said that is a very sinful looking appearance and it's not good. I had friends in Gaza that I was tutoring, young kids that I was tutoring in Gaza to learn English. And I would encourage them to meet up at cafes and be like, okay, talk to each other in English and learn. And several of them would report that they would be meeting at a coffee shop during the day. And then Hamas's, an intelligence officer of Hamas would approach them and be like, "Are you two married? Like, I need to see proof that you're both married." It's like Hamas was a very miniaturized version of ISIS that, tried to put on this nationalist umbrella. But that began when I was living there. In micro examples, I went to a summer camp. I'll share this as the last example. And my parents were again, not religious, but I went to a summer camp and my parents didn't know that it turned out it was a Hamas summer camp. And this was before they were training you how to shoot and do those silly
kidnap soldiers
things
like that.
precisely. But I remember distinctly they were talking to us about Hassan al-Banna, the founder of Hamas.
Of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Of the Muslim Brotherhood. I apologize. Let me restate this. They were talking to us about Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, and
of which Hamas is an offshoot.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely. And but I remember it was reeking of cheap propaganda. It wasn't even sophisticated the difference between persuasion and manipulation. Manipulation is when you don't make it clear that I'm trying to get you to believe something, but persuasion is like, believe this, and I just went back to my parents, and I remember it was the first and only day, and I did not go back to the rest of the camp not because my parents said, "Oh, Ahmed, we don't want you at a Hamas summer camp," because I told my parents how gross that was and how it just seemed so cheap. So this is where I really got a taste, and sorry, this one is the really important one. I actually met Ahmed Yassin, the founder, the founder of Hamas,
in the wheelchair.
In the wheelchair, yes, and so I spoke English better than like most people. I had a
So
real
what year
talent.
is
This is in 2001.
Okay.
So he came to the mosque right next to our house. So Hamas had a habit, unfortunately, of taking over mosques and then turning them away from houses of worship into propaganda outlets. And what they would do is they would actually, so they would control the sermons, they would control the after prayer lessons, they would hold lessons, lectures. Hamas leaders would come and give talks, and then they would have little, training sessions, blah blah blah, and then they would have print shops nearby that whenever there was a martyr or someone that was killed from Hamas, they would, you could tell that a mosque belonged to Hamas or the Palestinian Islamic Jihad by the signs, the signs and the pictures commemorating the martyrs, the fighters that were killed. So Ahmed Yassin came in a wheelchair to the mosque where right next to our home, but this was before the prayer, and he hung out. This was before people congregated, and so there was just a small group of youth, and I'll never forget, it was a green Land Rover, and he had 3 bodyguards with him. And when they got out, they had these, they called them Katsar, which is an Israeli M16. That's the shortened version. And they claimed that they had gotten it from an assault or an operation in which they took the rifles from the Israeli soldiers. And Ahmed Yassin started, his hands were very limited, but he had a little pouch right next to him, and he had one of his guards to come and take it out, and he was passing out 50 shekels to all the young kids around. And then the young kids were like, well, how do I be like this guy with the M16? And then Ahmed Yassin was like, oh, you got to listen to your parents. And then you got to go to the mosque 5 times a day. And you got to be good at school. And then you got to learn the religion. And it wasn't about like learn how to be a jihadi. It was all about the early onset of the indoctrination. And I remember that very vividly.
And I think you've kind of got ahead of a question I was going to ask, because the Muslim Brotherhood is very relevant to the UK right now. You know, we've seen the UAE saying that they won't send students to the UK anymore because of that infiltration. We've seen traces of Muslim Brotherhood infiltration around various communities in the UK. And I think Gaza just gives us an example of how they actually operate, because they start from the bottom up, don't they? They start through the mosques. Can you just talk a little about how you saw Hamas taking over in that way, from sort of that spread from the bottom, rather than, say, a top-down revolution?
Precisely. And so, let's bring it to the UNRWA schools. And I want to challenge people a little bit on UNRWA, because I think, unfortunately, there is kind of this, as with many things that I try to speak about, nothing is black and white. Believe it or not, when I was in Gaza, and up to a certain extent, even not that a few years ago, UNRWA actually was disciplining teachers who were overtly pushing, jihadi or resistance narratives. And I personally know of some teachers who were disciplined. But Hamas, for example, started actively focusing on how to get the maximum number of its supporters, people that believed in its ideology. They didn't have to be card-carrying members of Hamas, but people who tangentially were affiliated with Hamas or supported Hamas into the UNRWA system, because the UNRWA system was the premier in terms of the quality of the education, but also 2/3 of Gazans are classified as refugees or descendants of refugees. And so that meant, and the rest go to government schools.
And just to say, just in case there are people listening or watching who don't know what UNRWA is, it's the UN agency responsible for looking after the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank as refugees, separate from the overall refugee agency that looks after refugees all over the world.
Precisely that. And they also have operations in Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. And the refugee population is that began, it came about in the 1948, what Palestinians refer to as the Nakba, or the catastrophe, or what Israel refers to as the War of Independence. And my parents and grandparents on both sides were expelled in 1948 and left, and so that's how we ended up being part of the UN agency, if you will. And I'll share a little bit about my own critiques of UNRWA later, but the idea being that the majority, UNRWA was the backbone of Gaza's education and humanitarian sector, if you will. And this is while I was there. And it became more so, I would say, after I left, and especially when Hamas took over. And so, to your question, Andrew, yes, it was like Ahmed Yassin said. He didn't say learn how to shoot a gun. He didn't say learn the history of Zionism. He didn't say learn what the weakness of Israel is. It was discipline. It was, and he had a point of make sure that at minimum, the morning and the evening prayers you do in the mosque, because those are the ones that, so the early morning prayers that are like at 4:30 in the morning, and you have to wake up and be really disciplined for those. Make sure that, like there was an effort, for example, and the local mosque, our local mosque went through a renovation. And so and everybody in the neighborhood just like volunteered physical labor. And I geeked out on some of the construction. There was like a little bit of demolition and then used mortar so I geeked out on it. And actually some of the people that were effectively Hamas, they actually, because I was a very, very good student academically and I spoke English really well, they actually came to me and they stopped me from they said, we want you to focus on your studies. We don't want your parents to say that you being at the mosque made you a bad student. But they would later on be furious several years later when I left to the United States, because they had believed that somehow I would naturally bring my English skills to them. So
you're saying that you were being groomed by Hamas?
Oh, very much so. Very much so. And that, I've been transparent about that. And that was part of my asylum claim in the United States. I applied for asylum because I spoke English really well. And they thought that was a very, very important skill that they wanted. But I was always much more mature for my age. I was always an old soul in a young body. And so
in a parallel life, if you wouldn't have left Gaza and they would have continued to groom you, God forbid, you could have ended up in Hamas. You could have been brainwashed and they could have
potentially, God forbid. Or I'll be honest with you, and I think this is where both of my parents, because it was my parents, I was 15 when I left Gaza. And the idea was to leave Gaza for 1 year and go back. But they had they just believed that somehow this would lead to me not being back in Gaza. They didn't know about the abduction of Gilad Shalit that would ultimately lead to the borders being closed and me not going. They just believed that once I left, khalas, that was it. But they knew that, I did not keep my mouth shut. Not in terms of I was a little bit a combination of a comedian. I asked questions that were a little bit too critical. And just like that reaction that I had at that summer camp, so they were worried that I would run my mouth, and that would lead to negative consequences. But the idea being, UNRWA became a space where Hamas would send a lot of its directly and indirectly, and it was a long term. So that's strike two. Strike one is the methodology of education. This is how Qatar did it in the United States, for example, and the Free Press did some incredible reporting on that, as far as investing in after school Arabic programs. Muslim Quran tutoring, that's benign. Middle Eastern studies departments here and there and here and there, new campuses for think tanks and universities in Doha. And you just layer and layer and layer all of these benign things that teach academic discipline, that engage on the family front, the religious front. And then strike two is it was always long term. Hamas does not think short term. And that connects, by the way, to the foolish idea that, right now Hamas is going to voluntarily disarm and this is going to be a repeat.
Yeah, and I think that brings us nicely up to date, actually. That's a good segue into talking about where we are in Gaza today. But I thought it would be...
do that.
Sorry,
just to complete your initial question about the Muslim Brotherhood, what you're saying is that the technique that you saw in Gaza of Hamas gradually taking over in terms of seeming benign in the first place, then getting more strict, then becoming militant, and then becoming a Stasi-like sort of Islamist sort of regime. That's those steps. You've seen it in America under Qatar, and we're seeing it here in Britain. It's the Muslim Brotherhood playbook over a long time.
Certainly. And I want to clarify something. Like I don't want this to be misunderstood. Like, two things can be true at once. I don't want this to be misunderstood as I'm trying to stow the fears of paranoia and every Muslim is somehow participating in this like secret plot to take over and implement Sharia law. But unfortunately, that is like Muslim Brotherhood 101. And it's not just the Muslim Brotherhood as the so two things are true. Like we can have respect for the fact that many Muslims are not in the UK and beyond are not participants in said vision. And at the same time, it is absolutely the case that is the Muslim Brotherhood playbook, but also it's not as if there's a centralized Muslim Brotherhood brain and nervous system that is directing this plot. It is a decentralized, long-term effort, generational effort that Hassan al-Banna began over a century ago, and that it would be foolish to think that what we're seeing in Canada, what we're seeing in the UK, what we're seeing in parts of Australia, what we're seeing in France and elsewhere in Europe is somehow not part of, a cohesive desire that other people are seeing as a vision to try to Islamize Europe, to try to actually restrict the margins for like to me, my dog in the fight, for example, is I don't want to lose Western values to regressive, nihilistic beliefs. But also, for example, why is it that some of the worst attacks against me come out of the UK and London in particular? People who are not Palestinian want to out-Palestinian an actual Palestinian. And by the way, like I keep saying, I might be the loud, unique voice on social media, but I am far from being alone. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of Ahmeds out there, both in Gaza and in the diaspora. But the barrier to entry has historically been high, and it's becoming even higher entry to a new dynamic, if you will.
But also that brings us back to the Muslim Brotherhood, because Muslim Brotherhood here in Britain prevents Ahmeds like you from speaking out with a threat of retribution. And so they radicalize the community. They appoint themselves as spokespersons of the community to speak, to liaise with government and so on. And then the everyday Muslims are the ones who really suffer because they're unable to act and to speak out. And to make matters worse, they see mainstream society indulging the Muslim Brotherhood. So they think, well, if you're going to indulge it, what chance have I got of standing up?
Or on top of that, they see the other side doing the all Muslims piece.
Exactly.
So it's a rock and a hard place, isn't it?
Exactly that. And that's why I think it's really important that when we do we want to leave that plenty of margin because I dislike this term, but let's just say the moderate elements of the Muslim community. We want to encourage them and leave plenty of margin, for they are the ones that I think ultimately will be the key, the spearhead and the antidote in combating the Muslim Brotherhood. But at the same time, when you look at a lot of Arab countries, not just the Gulf countries, not just the UAE and Saudi Arabia, but you look at many Arab countries in North Africa, for example, and you look at Jordan and how they've banned the Muslim Brotherhood. They don't allow the kinds of nefarious activities we've seen over the last 2 years. You look at the United States slowly trying to catch up, but somehow the UK is asleep at the wheel. That's really concerning, and we should be asking questions of the leadership here. And I'm saying that as an outside observer. I'm humble in that I'm not a British or a UK citizen, but I think there needs to be a clear pressure in that direction to actually reduce the margin for these people to continue to radicalize the Muslim community.
Yeah. Fully agree, and I think we've talked about that a lot on this so far. And
we have, yeah. Do you want to ask one more question about that before you go to Gaza? So I know
I'll be beneficent. Please do.
Okay, one just quick question before we move on to the meat of what we want to talk about Gaza. In terms of righting this wrong or setting ourselves back on our feet with regard to the infiltration of the Muslim Brotherhood here in the West, do you think that we talk a lot about what we can do here in terms of legislation, banning them, proscribing them, being tougher on hate preachers, etc., etc., etc. But do you think that there's something that could happen from the Saudis' point of view? There could be a top-down diktat, some strength coming from that point of view to Muslims around, as the place that's got Mecca and Medina there, that may be aligned with joining Israel in the Abraham Accords at some future date, that could have a beneficial impact on Muslim communities around the world through the West to make them more moderate and to exclude the Muslim Brotherhood?
Well, so there's something to be said there, despite the complexity of the geopolitics involved, that unfortunately, this is why October 7th happened in terms of Hamas wanting to set that back. And this is where the Islamic Republic of Iran has been really nefarious in perpetuating that. I mean, what does the Muslim Brotherhood mind feast on? Perpetual anti-Israel agenda, and the desire to Islamize the society. They talk about Islamizing the present society, but very much so, it is an expansionist agenda. It is not just about, we're operating in Egypt and we just want to Islamize Egypt. It's like we want to operate in Egypt and then expand to Libya and Gaza and Sudan and then onto the Gulf. And then once the Middle East is then we want to go on to Turkey and to Iran. And then we want to head to Europe. And then we want to head to, that is in their literature. That is not, Islamophobia. Why are you talking about the expansionist, Muslim Brotherhood? So Islamophobic of you. You're an agent of hate. My goodness, that is kindergarten level literature of the Muslim Brotherhood. So on the one hand, as an American, I do believe fiercely in the freedom of speech and the First Amendment. On the other hand, I feel that the Muslim Brotherhood has been abusing the liberties, Western-style liberties that are, by the way, non-existent, not just in Arab and Muslim societies, but also within the laws of the Muslim Brotherhood. The group itself, the ideology of the group itself, does not allow for the kinds of social liberties and political liberties that they use to commandeer Western societies.
And Abraham Accords role for the Saudis, do you think that could?
I worry that I think that will help. However, what I've seen that help in the United Arab Emirates. I took my family out after during the war, and I lost family members, and some of the survivors I took to the UAE. I've been going to the UAE for over a decade. I go there all the time. An incredible place, and I've seen the de-radicalizing effect that the Abraham Accords have had on the population. Though I would argue that some of that preceded the Abraham Accords. That said, one of the ways in which I want to do that is a focus on Gaza, for example. I actually think there's an opening in Gaza, and we'll get to that but in a second. But very briefly, I actually think there's a total disconnect between the pro-Palestine audiences, of which the Muslim Brotherhood is a major conglomerate, in the diaspora versus the Palestinian people in Gaza, particularly the younger generations who are disillusioned with the Palestinian National Project, who are disillusioned with Hamas, who are done with the resistance narrative, and they want to pursue the nation-building narrative, which is critical for the coexistence narrative. So there's a sequencing there. And I think that, and using the opening that we have right now, and not screwing up the Board of Peace and ensuring the survival of Hamas, as I've been screaming over the last few days, that is the ultimate way to delegitimize the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamist agenda, is to actually rob them of the ability to point to Gaza and say, this is why, Hamas is a legitimate resistance group. This is why, Israel is an inherent settler colonial entity with which there can never be any peace or coexistence, when you have Gazans actually saying, you know what, actually, this 77 years of armed resistance hasn't done us any good. Let's actually try something different. In my humble opinion, Gaza could be the starting point, and then that actually could compel Saudi Arabia to look at Gaza and be like, okay, maybe we can, because now unfortunately they've created this pathway to Palestinian statehood, and like and now they can't back down from that. When I think the Saudis should, I think, if I were MBS, I would have actually been like, oh yeah, Hamas, you started a destructive war that, engulfed the entirety of the Middle East to stop me from normalizing with the Israelis, to fulfill the agendas of the mullahs regime and the ayatollahs in Iran. I'm actually going to normalize. Like, I thought surely that would be the comeback for MBS. Clearly, that has not been the case.
What do you think of that optimism, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way the Middle East is now fracturing is really interesting, because I think you've gone from, clear militarized threats, and we're now moving into an era where you have essentially mid-tier powers who are now starting to all compete for that prominence. So you've got Qatar, Turkey on one side, and then you've got UAE now competing with Saudi. They've
Precisely.
had a serious falling out. And I think it potentially makes that less likely, unless it is sold to them in terms that would make them more powerful as a regional player. So that would be, for me, the angle. If you can say to Saudi, look, if you normalize with Israel, you will then become the preeminent power in the Middle East, notwithstanding Israel itself. I think that's the incentive, because it's now a competition. It wasn't 2 years ago, it massively is now. And that's the dynamic I think you need to address.
Why don't you take us into the weeds on Gaza?
Yes, let's do it. So, I'm really interested. I think it's really important to platform this, is to talk about what it's like for people in Gaza right now. Because there's a lot to cut through. There's all those silly videos of snow and all that sort of stuff, and they're beating that drum. But obviously, of course, it can get cold. People are intense. It's pretty miserable. Some people are fine because there's videos there of shops and hotels and restaurants being opened and that kind of thing. So what's it actually like for an average Gazan living in this kind of post-war world, and what role is Hamas playing?
If you've been enjoying the conversation so far, don't panic. To catch the rest of the episode, just head over to our Substack at thebrinkpodcast.co.uk.